All right, revisiting the cat ownership and mental illness study that we looked at in section 4.3. Recall that we did find a fairly strong link between having owned a cat as a young child and having mental illness such as schizophrenia later in life. The p-value from this study, if you recall, was 0.004. You can go look that up in your 4.3 notes to ensure that it's correct. And that p-value being smaller than 0.01 would give us very strong evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis or against the null hypothesis, and therefore very strong evidence that cat ownership as a child is associated with higher chances of schizophrenia as an adult later in life. Now, having very strong evidence that there is an association isn't the same thing as saying that the association itself is very strong, right? So if we look at just some sample statistics, which we would have trouble calculating directly from the information that we were given, but if we add in the fact that schizophrenia is fairly uncommon and that it occurs in less than 1% of the population, we can get some rough estimates of what these proportions should be, where we say the proportion who are later diagnosed with schizophrenia who did have a cat as a child and the proportion who did not. So that we're looking at these two numbers here, the proportion with a cat with schizophrenia and the proportion without a cat who gets schizophrenia. Practical significance acknowledges that we do have an association and that we do have strong evidence of an association, but it looks at everything other than the p-value. So what else is there to note from this study? What is the takeaway, right? Looking at these two numbers, we can see that it does seem like if there's a causal association, that having the cat does increase your chances of getting schizophrenia. It does not mean, just because there's strong evidence of an association, it does not mean you're really, really likely to develop mental illness if you have a cat. So we want to look at these numbers, look at our evidence, and come up with a statement that takes everything into account. So we can start with, okay, the statistical significance is that we have strong evidence, we have very strong evidence of an association here. For our practical significance, we want to keep in mind that very strong evidence of an association does not mean evidence of a very strong association. The association could still be pretty weak. And looking at these numbers or looking at a confidence interval gives us a better idea of the magnitude of the association. So it's not a really weak association. These are definitely different from one another, but the chance of developing schizophrenia is still fairly low in both cases. So part of our observation might be that even if this is a causal association, which hasn't been determined, the chance of developing schizophrenia is quite low regardless of whether you had a cat. A strong association doesn't mean if you have a cat you're definitely going to develop mental illness. It just means we have very strong evidence that it has some effect, or in the event that this really isn't a causal association, that at least there is a tendency for these two to go together. When talking about practical significance, there's any number of things that you might choose to focus on. You could also say, well, really any increase in the chance of mental illness is too high a risk because mental illness has so much of an effect on your own life and the lives of those around you. So you could choose to focus on that. There's lots of things we could say here. The main point is it's not a statement about the p-value. It's acknowledging what the p-value tells us and then looking at all of the other details also to indicate whether this is an important result or not. So another observation that we could put in here that is of practical significance is that an increase in the likelihood of developing schizophrenia may still outweigh the benefits of having a cat. So all of these are reasonable things to comment on for practical significance. There's not just one correct answer here. The main thing is that we know how to interpret that p-value and that we know to look at some of the other details of the test also and determine whether it is of general importance overall and why.